Sometimes the hardest thing about marriage isn't the big fights, it's the quiet moments when you realize you're living with a stranger. Clara Martinez sits across from her husband at breakfast, watching him scroll through his phone and wonders when they stopped really seeing each other. At 38, she's watching bulldozers prepare to tear down St. Catherine's Church, the same place where she and Daniel promised to love each other forever. The workers don't care about the memories held in those walls or the beautiful Virgin Mary statue that has watched over families for generations. When Clara sees them getting ready to destroy everything, something inside her snaps. She can't save her marriage from falling apart, but she can save this one sacred thing. Clara rushes to rescue the old statue before the demolition begins, bringing Mary home like she's saving a piece of her own heart. What happens next surprises everyone, especially Clara herself. Can an old statue really help heal a broken marriage? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, where Clara Martinez sat, with her coffee growing cold. 15 years ago, she and Daniel had picked out this house together, imagining Sunday mornings filled with children's laughter. Instead, silence stretched between them, broken only by Daniel's fingers clicking on his phone screen. "The Hendersons are getting divorced," Clara said, hoping to spark conversation. Daniel glanced up briefly. "That's too bad." His attention returned to his phone immediately. Clara studied her husband's profile, noting the new lines around his eyes and silver threading through his black hair. When had he stopped looking at her when she spoke? The wedding photo on the counter caught her eye, a younger Clara and Daniel beaming outside St. Catherine's Church. That woman had believed in forever. "I need to stop by St. Catherine's today," Clara said. Daniel looked up with practical concern. "Why?" "They're starting demolition this week. That's why I want to say goodbye." Daniel shook his head slightly. "It's just a building, Clara. Father Miguel found a new location. Just a building. St. Catherine's wasn't just a building. It was where she'd received First Communion, where they'd married, where she'd prayed through her mother's illness. It was her anchor through every major moment of adult life." "I know. It seems silly," she said quietly. "Not silly, just practical. Change happens. No point dwelling on things we can't control." Clara wondered when Daniel's pragmatism had become so cold, so dismissive of things that mattered to her heart. At 38, she worked as a guidance counselor at Jefferson Middle School, gifted at seeing past teenagers' defensive attitudes, to recognize their underlying hurt. Her colleagues marveled at her patience. What they didn't know was that Clara understood what it felt like to have important feelings dismissed. Daniel worked as an architect for a commercial firm downtown, designing office buildings with methodical precision. Their life had developed a rhythm as reliable as clockwork and about as romantic. He left at 7:30, returned at 6:15, spent evenings reviewing blueprints. Next door lived Mrs. Kowalski, a 73-year-old widow who'd become Clara's unofficial confidant. Helen had been married 51 years before losing Stanley to a heart attack. "Marriage isn't a feeling, dear," Mrs. Kowalski had told Clara last week in her garden. "Feelings come and go like weather. Marriage is a decision you make every day, even when you don't feel like it." Clara had nodded politely, but wondered what Helen could understand about a marriage that felt like careful choreography rather than genuine connection. The demolition announcement had appeared 3 weeks ago, buried on page 4. The Archdiocese sold the property to developers planning condominiums. Father Miguel, who'd served 27 years, would be reassigned across town. Clara had read the article 3 times. The 1924 limestone building, with its stained glass windows, represented generations of faith and sacrifice. The Virgin Mary statue in the side chapel had been her constant companion through every prayer, every plea, every moment brought to that sacred space. Daniel's response had been characteristically practical. "At least Father Miguel will have a better facility. That old church needed work." He wasn't wrong. Drafty windows, unreliable heating, peeling paint. But Clara didn't love the building for its condition. She loved it for its constancy. That evening, as Clara prepared dinner and Daniel reviewed drawings, she studied the back of his head, trying to remember their last meaningful conversation. When had they stopped sharing thoughts and feelings? "How was your day?" Daniel asked, glancing up as she served chicken and rice. "Fine," Clara replied automatically, though her day included consoling a seventh grader whose parents were divorcing. "Yours?" "Good, busy. The Morrison project's moving forward." They ate in silence that once felt peaceful but now highlighted everything unspoken. Daniel checked his phone twice. Clara looked again at the wedding photo, wondering what advice she'd give that hopeful young woman. After dinner, Daniel disappeared into his office while Clara cleaned up. This had become their routine, parallel lives intersecting only at practical necessity. Heading upstairs, Clara paused at the window, showing St. Catherine's bell tower in the distance. Soon that familiar silhouette would be gone, replaced by condominiums with sanitized names bearing no connection to the heritage being erased. In bed, Clara lay awake listening to Daniel's steady breathing, staring at the ceiling. They slept on respective sides of the king-sized mattress, careful not to accidentally touch. When had physical affection become so awkward? Tomorrow, she would visit St. Catherine's one last time. She would sit in their old pew, light a candle for her mother's memory, and try to make peace with another ending. What Clara couldn't imagine was that her visit would lead to an impulsive decision that would change everything, that her desperate act of preservation would become the first step toward rediscovering not only her faith, but the love she thought she and Daniel had lost forever. Sunday morning at St. Catherine's felt different from the moment Clara stepped through the heavy oak doors. The sanctuary buzzed with subdued energy. Conversations carried the weight of finality, and every gesture seemed deliberate, as if people were trying to memorize the experience. Clara slipped into the third pew on the left, the same spot where she and Daniel had sat throughout their marriage. The familiar creak of the wooden seat welcomed her like an old friend. Around her, parishioners filled nearly every space. Many faces she recognized from years of shared worship. Others she'd never seen before, but who had clearly returned for this final goodbye. Father Miguel stood at the altar, his silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. At 68, he moved with the careful grace of a man who had learned to find dignity in limitation. His homily spoke of seasons and transitions, of how endings often prepared the ground for new beginnings. "We take with us not these walls," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of his childhood in El Salvador, "but the faith that has grown strong within them. The building may come down, but what we have built together in our hearts, that endures." Clara found herself clutching the final church bulletin, a simple folded paper that announced the morning's readings and reminded parishioners about the parish potluck that would never happen. Such an ordinary thing to hold such significance, but she couldn't bear to let it go. After the service, Clara approached Father Miguel as he greeted parishioners in the narthex. His weathered hands enveloped hers with familiar warmth. "Clara, my dear, how are you managing all of this?" "I'm not sure I'm managing it," she admitted. "It feels like losing family." Father Miguel nodded slowly. "You know, I've been thinking about Noah recently. God asked him to preserve what was precious before the flood came. Sometimes we're called to save what seems lost. But I can't save this place. Perhaps not the building, but faith, Clara. Faith finds a way to survive." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching families take final photographs, children running between the pews one last time. Clara had expected to feel sad, but what surprised her was the anger building in her chest. This place had served faithfully for nearly a century, and now it would be reduced to rubble for luxury condominiums. Monday morning arrived grey and cold. Clara called in sick to work, something she'd done perhaps 3 times in her entire career, and drove to St. Catherine's instead. The demolition crew had already arrived, their trucks and equipment arranged like an invasion force around the building's perimeter. She parked across the street and watched the workers set up their barriers and organize their tools. Everything about their presence felt violent, purposeful in its destruction. Clara found herself gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. A movement in the side chapel window caught her eye. The Virgin Mary statue stood in its alcove, serene and patient as always. Clara had spent countless hours in that chapel, lighting candles for her mother during the cancer treatment, praying for guidance during the rough patches in her marriage, seeking comfort when life felt too heavy to bear alone. The statue had been carved from limestone sometime in the 1930s, a gift from an Italian immigrant family whose grandson had died in World War II. Mary's face bore the gentle expression of someone who had known both great joy and profound sorrow. Her hands, worn smooth by decades of touch, extended in a gesture of welcome and blessing. Something fierce awakened in Clara as she watched the demolition foreman point toward the chapel. They were going to destroy her. This beautiful, sacred figure would be reduced to rubble and hauled away in a dumpster, her centuries of faithful presence dismissed as architectural debris. Clara got out of her car without conscious decision. She walked across the street, past the barrier tape, past the no trespassing signs, directly toward the side entrance of the church. "Ma'am, you can't be here," called one of the workers, a young man with kind eyes who seemed genuinely sorry to have to stop her. "I just need 5 minutes," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Please, 5 minutes in the chapel." The foreman, a heavy-set man with calloused hands, looked annoyed. "Lady, we got a schedule to keep. This whole place comes down today. What happens to the statue? The Virgin Mary in the side chapel?" He shrugged. "Gets disposed of with everything else, unless someone claimed it already, which nobody did. I'm claiming it now." The words came out before Clara had time to think them through. The foreman stared at her like she'd announced her intention to fly to the moon. "You want to take that statue? Lady, that thing's got to weigh 300 pounds, solid stone. And I'll figure out how to move it. I just need... Look, I don't got time for this. You want it? You got 20 minutes before we start demo on that section. After that, it's gone." Clara called Daniel from her cell phone, pacing frantically outside. "The chapel." "Clara? What's wrong? I thought you were sick. I need your help right now at St. Catherine's. What are you talking about? Shouldn't you be home resting?" "Daniel, please, I need you to come here with your truck. I need help moving something." The silence stretched long enough that Clara wondered if the call had dropped. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice carried the patient tone he used when he thought she was being unreasonable. "Clara, what exactly are you trying to move?" "The Virgin Mary statue from the side chapel. They're going to destroy her, Daniel. They're going to throw her away like garbage." "Honey, that's not our statue. We can't just take church property." "Father Miguel said no one claimed it. It's going to be destroyed anyway." Another long pause. "Clara, be practical. Where would we put a 300-pound statue? What would we do with it?" "I don't know. I just know I can't let them destroy her." Clara heard Daniel sigh deeply, and she could picture him rubbing his temples the way he did when work stress overwhelmed him. "This is crazy, Clara." "Maybe. But will you help me anyway?" When Daniel arrived 30 minutes later with his pickup truck and a furniture dolly borrowed from their neighbor, his expression mixed concern with barely controlled frustration. Clara had spent the waiting time sitting in the chapel with the statue, trying to understand her own compulsive need to save this particular piece of her past. "I still think this is insane," Daniel said, as they studied the logistics of moving the statue. "We don't even know if it will fit through the door." "We'll make it fit." The process took 2 hours and required help from 3 construction workers, who seemed amused by the whole situation. The statue was indeed heavy, awkward to grip, and challenging to maneuver through the narrow chapel doorway. Clara scraped her knuckles and tore her jacket, but she refused to give up. When they finally loaded Mary into the truck bed, securing her with moving blankets and rope. Clara felt a strange mixture of triumph and terror. She had done something completely impractical, potentially destructive to her marriage, and utterly necessary to her soul. The drive home passed in tense silence. Daniel kept checking his rearview mirror, making sure their precious cargo remained secure. Clara stared out the passenger window, wondering what exactly she planned to do with a 300-pound limestone statue and how she would explain this decision to her husband. As they pulled into their driveway, Clara realized she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. For the first time in years, she had acted purely from her heart, without considering practicalities or consequences. It felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The Virgin Mary would spend that first night in their living room, a silent witness to the beginning of everything that would follow. Clara woke before dawn, drawn by an inexplicable need to check on the statue. She found Mary exactly where they'd left her in the living room, serene and solid in the pale morning light. The incongruity struck her anew. This sacred figure surrounded by their beige furniture and carefully coordinated throw pillows. Daniel appeared in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, still wearing the bewildered expression he'd adopted yesterday afternoon. "So this is really happening," he said, studying the statue like it might explain itself. "I couldn't let them destroy her. Clara, what are we supposed to do with it? We can't keep a 300-pound statue in our living room forever." Clara had no answer. She only knew that seeing Mary safe in their home filled her with a peace she hadn't experienced in months. She ran her fingers along the statue's weathered base, feeling the slight roughness of limestone worn smooth by decades of devotion. After Daniel left for work, their goodbye kiss perfunctory as always, Clara called in sick again and drove to the hardware store. She returned with cleaning supplies, fine brushes, and wood polish, items that felt sacred in their simplicity. The restoration work became a meditation. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully cleaning years of dust and candle wax from Mary's robes. Each small revelation, the delicate carving of fingers, the subtle smile, the way light played across the folds of stone fabric, felt like receiving a gift. Mrs. Kowalski knocked around noon, carrying a tray of sandwiches and her characteristic directness. "So I see you've got yourself a new roommate," Helen said, settling into Clara's armchair with the familiarity of old friendship. "Daniel thinks I've lost my mind. Have you?" Clara looked up from her work, a cleaning cloth still in her hands. "Maybe. I just couldn't bear to see her destroyed." Helen studied the statue thoughtfully. "Stanley and I had 47 years together before he got sick. You know what I learned? Sometimes the things that seem crazy to other people are the things that save us. Daniel doesn't understand why this matters so much. Men often don't understand the need to preserve things. They think in terms of function and logic. We understand that some things matter simply because they've witnessed our lives." That evening, Daniel came home to find Clara still working on the statue, now focused on polishing the base where decades of kneeling parishioners had worn the stone smooth. "This has to stop, Clara. It's been 2 days. You missed work again." "I'm taking care of something important. It's a statue, a piece of stone." Clara set down her polishing cloth and looked at her husband directly. "When did you stop caring about things that can't be reduced to practical terms? When did you start making major decisions without talking to me first?" The question hung between them, years of careful politeness suddenly stripped away. Clara realized she couldn't remember the last time they'd had a real argument or a real conversation about anything that mattered. "I've been talking to you for months about how much this church meant to me. You just weren't listening. That's not fair, isn't it? When I told you about the demolition, you said it was just a building. When I wanted to say goodbye, you said I was being impractical. When have my feelings about anything been practical enough for you to take seriously?" Daniel sat heavily on the couch, running his hands through his hair. "I'm just trying to keep us grounded, Clara. Someone has to be realistic about our life." "What life, Daniel?" "We have a routine. We have responsibilities. But when did we stop having a life? The silence that followed felt different from their usual careful quiet. Charged with things that had been building for years, Clara returned to her polishing, surprised by her own courage in speaking so directly. That night, Daniel went to bed first as always. Clara remained in the living room, with Mary, the statue's presence oddly comforting in the lamplight. For the first time in months, Clara found herself praying, not the formal prayers of her childhood, but a raw conversation with whatever force had compelled her to save this figure. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered to the stone face. "But I know I couldn't let them destroy you." The next morning brought a surprise. Clara woke to find Daniel sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, researching statue restoration techniques. "I thought maybe we should do this properly," he said without looking up. "If you're determined to keep her, we should at least take care of her correctly." Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not quite forgiveness, but a recognition that Daniel was trying to meet her halfway, even if he didn't understand her motivation. They worked together that weekend. Daniel's architectural eye guiding the structural assessment, while Clara continued the delicate cleaning work. The collaboration felt tentative but genuine, their first shared project in longer than either could remember. "She's beautiful," Daniel admitted, as they stepped back to assess their progress. "I mean, the craftsmanship is really remarkable." "She's more than beautiful. She's been a witness." "A witness to what?" Clara considered the question carefully. "To everything people brought to her. Every prayer, every plea, every moment of gratitude or desperation. She held space for all of it." Daniel nodded slowly, perhaps beginning to understand something he couldn't quite articulate, but the statue's presence continued to create tension. When Daniel's brother visited, he made jokes about Clara's religious phase. When their neighbor, Tom, stopped by, he wondered aloud why anyone would want that old thing cluttering up their living room. "It's not about religion," Clara found herself explaining repeatedly. "It's about preserving something meaningful." Yet privately, Clara wondered if it was about religion after all. She had stopped attending Mass regularly years ago their Sunday, mornings gradually claimed by household projects and lazy mornings in bed. But sitting with Mary, she felt connected to something larger than her daily concerns, a sense of continuity with the generations of women who had sought comfort from this same figure. The statue's eyes seemed to hold a question. What are you really trying to save? Clara didn't have an answer yet, but she was beginning to understand that her desperate act of preservation had awakened something in her that had been sleeping for far too long. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without taking inventory of everything that felt wrong with her life. Instead, she dreamed of limestone hands and the steady presence of something that had endured through decades of human joy and sorrow, still offering the same patient blessing to anyone willing to receive it. A week into the statue's residence, Clara discovered Daniel's old sketches while searching the garage for proper lighting to illuminate Mary's alcove in their living room. The portfolio lay buried beneath paint cans and forgotten Christmas decorations, its leather cover worn soft with age. Inside, pencil drawings revealed a Daniel she'd almost forgotten. Designs for small churches, community centers, places where people gathered to celebrate and mourn and find meaning together. The sketches dated from their early marriage, before Daniel joined the commercial firm, when he still talked about architecture as a calling rather than just a career. "I found these in the garage," Clara said that evening, spreading the drawings across the kitchen table. Daniel glanced up from his laptop, and Clara watched recognition flicker across his features, followed quickly by something that looked like pain. "You kept them," he said quietly. "Of course I kept them. They're beautiful, Daniel. This chapel design, it's extraordinary." Daniel closed his laptop and studied the sketch Clara had selected. "That was for a competition. I never submitted it." "Why not?" "Because it wasn't practical. Small churches don't make money. Young architects need to eat." Clara traced the elegant lines of the bell tower with her finger. "But you loved designing it." Love doesn't pay the mortgage. When did you stop trying to do both? Make money and create something meaningful. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying his younger self's hopeful designs. Somewhere along the way, I guess I decided that dreaming was a luxury we couldn't afford. What if we could afford it? What if we'd been so focused on security that we forgot what we were securing it for? That weekend, Daniel measured the living room and sketched ideas for displaying the statue properly. Clara watched him work, noting how his face changed when he focused on creative problem-solving rather than just fixing things. "What if we moved her to the back corner by the window?" he suggested. "The morning light would be perfect, and we could build a small platform to elevate her properly." "You want to build something for her?" "If we're going to do this, we should do it right." Clara felt a flutter of hope. Daniel was engaging with her decision, finding ways to make it work rather than just tolerate it. It wasn't the same as understanding, but it was effort. At work, Clara found herself better able to connect with her students. When 15-year-old Marcus sulked into her office after another suspension, she saw past his defensive anger to the fear underneath. "You want to know something crazy?" she told him. "Last week I rescued a 300-pound statue and put it in my living room. My husband thinks I've lost my mind." Marcus looked up, surprised into actual attention. "Why'd you do it?" "Because sometimes you have to save something, even when you can't save everything." "That's weird advice, Ms. Martinez. The best advice usually is." When Clara suggested marriage counseling that evening, Daniel's immediate response was defensive. "We don't need counseling. We just need to figure out how to communicate better." "Isn't that what counseling is for? I can't talk to some stranger about our private business, but you can ignore our private business indefinitely?" Daniel looked stung. "I'm not ignoring anything. I've been trying to support your statue thing, haven't I? Supporting something and understanding it are different." "Fine. What exactly am I supposed to understand?" Clara looked at Mary, solid and patient in the corner, and tried to find words for feelings she was still discovering. "I saved her because I couldn't save anything else. Our marriage feels like it's dying and I don't know how to fix it. The church where we made our promises is gone. My mother is gone. Everything that used to feel permanent keeps disappearing." "So, you rescued a statue. So I rescued something sacred." Daniel studied her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time in months. "Is that what you think I am? Something that's disappearing, aren't you?" The question hung between them, too honest to dismiss and too painful to answer quickly. That night, Clara lay awake, listening to Daniel toss restlessly beside her. Around midnight, she heard him get up and pad quietly downstairs. From the bedroom window, she could see the living room light come on. When she crept down an hour later, she found Daniel sitting in the chair across from Mary, just looking at her in the lamplight. "Can't sleep?" Clara asked softly. "I keep thinking about what you said, about things disappearing." Clara settled on the couch, close enough to talk quietly, but far enough to give Daniel space. "I look at her, and I think about all the people who prayed to her over the years," Daniel said. "All the marriages she witnessed, all the promises made in that chapel. Most of those couples are probably gone now, dead or divorced or just apart. Does that make their prayers meaningless? I don't know. I keep wondering what she would tell us if she could talk." Clara smiled. "Probably that marriage is harder than we expected and more important than we realized." "When did we stop being friends, Clara?" The question caught her off guard with its simple honesty. "I don't know. Somewhere between trying so hard to be good partners that we forgot to be lovers." Daniel reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. The contact felt foreign and familiar simultaneously, skin she'd touched thousands of times. Suddenly electric with possibility. "I miss you," he said simply. "I miss you too." They sat holding hands in the statue's patient presence, two people who had shared a bed for 15 years, finally acknowledging that sharing space wasn't the same as sharing a life. "Maybe we could try counseling," Daniel said eventually. "Really? Really?" But only if we can find someone who won't think it's crazy that we're taking marriage advice in front of a stolen statue." Clara laughed, and the sound surprised them both. When had they stopped laughing together? "She's not stolen, she's rescued." "Right, rescued, like us, maybe." Looking at Daniel in the lamplight, his hair mussed from restless sleep and his hand warm in hers, Clara felt something she'd almost forgotten, the flutter of genuine affection for this man who was trying to meet her in a place neither of them fully understood. The statue watched over them both, her limestone hands extended in blessing over two people learning to reach for each other again. While organizing Daniel's old portfolio to make room for his new sketches of the statue's display, Clara discovered a shoebox tucked behind his drafting supplies. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, lay bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. There, correspondence from the first year of marriage, when Daniel had traveled frequently for work. Clara's heart caught as she recognized her own handwriting, young and eager, covering page after page with observations about her day, dreams for their future, declarations of love that felt almost embarrassingly earnest now. Daniel's responses, written in his careful architect's hand, revealed a man who noticed everything. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, her habit of humming while cooking, the dreams she shared about the children they would raise, and the life they would build together. "I can't believe you kept these," Clara said that evening, finding Daniel in his office reviewing blueprints. He looked up to see the shoebox in her hands, and his expression softened immediately. "I kept everything," he said quietly. "Every letter. Every card, that napkin from our first anniversary dinner where you wrote that terrible poem. It wasn't terrible, it was romantic. It was both." Clara pulled out a letter at random and read aloud. "My darling Clara, I spent an hour at lunch today watching an old couple share a sandwich at the park, and all I could think was that I want to be them in 50 years, still choosing to sit close together, still finding excuses to touch each other's hands." Daniel's face flushed. "I can't believe I wrote things like that. When did you stop writing things like that? When did you stop inspiring them?" The question stung because Clara couldn't answer it. She couldn't pinpoint when their conversations had become logistics meetings, when their physical affection had dwindled to perfunctory kisses. Goodbye. They spent the weekend reading their old letters aloud, marveling at the couple they used to be. Young Clara had written detailed accounts of her students, her hopes for making a difference in their lives. Young Daniel had shared his architectural philosophies, his belief that buildings could create community and inspire the human spirit. "Listen to this," Clara said, unfolding a letter from their second year of marriage. "You wrote, 'I want to design spaces where people fall in love, where children feel safe, where old couples remember why they chose each other. Architecture isn't just about function. It's about creating containers for human connection.'" Daniel set down his own letter and looked at her seriously. "I still believe that. Then why did you stop trying to design those spaces? Because the world doesn't pay architects to care about human connection. It pays us to maximize square footage and minimize costs. What if the world was wrong? That." Sunday, Father Miguel visited to bless the statue in their home, arriving with a small bottle of holy water and a worn breviary. At 78, he moved carefully, but his presence filled their living room with a dignity that made their modern furniture seem suddenly insubstantial. "She looks happy here," he said, studying Mary's placement by the window, where morning light caught the subtle contours of her face. "Do you think it was wrong to take her?" Clara asked. "I think she was meant to continue her ministry. That doesn't always happen in church buildings." Father Miguel blessed both the statue and their home, his Latin prayers creating a sense of ceremony that had been missing from their lives. When he finished, he sat with them for coffee and spoke about marriage with the gentle authority of someone who had counseled couples for 4 decades. "Marriage is like tending a garden," he told them. "You can't plant once and expect it to flourish without attention. It requires daily care, seasonal pruning, faith that growth happens even when you can't see it." What if you've neglected the garden for so long you're not sure anything will grow anymore? Daniel asked. Then you start where you are, with what you have, and trust in the possibility of renewal. After Father Miguel left, Clara and Daniel sat in their transformed living room, the statue's presence somehow making everything else, their furniture, their routine, their careful distance, seem negotiable. I've been thinking about what you said, Daniel told her, about designing spaces for human connection. And what if I started small? What if I designed something for her? He gestured toward Mary, a proper shrine for the backyard, something that would honor what she means to you. Clara felt tears gather unexpectedly. You would do that? I want to try. I want to create something beautiful for someone I love. That evening, they made love for the first time in 3 months, tentative at first, then with growing urgency as they rediscovered each other's bodies and responses. Afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled like possibility, Clara traced patterns on Daniel's chest and marveled at how foreign and familiar he felt simultaneously. I want us to work, she whispered against his shoulder. We are working. This, what we're doing now, this is work. Good work. The best kind. Monday brought practical challenges. Daniel's boss questioned his request for time off to work on a personal project. Clara's principal expressed concern about her recent absences. The ordinary world seemed determined to pull them back into old patterns of prioritizing obligation over connection. But something had shifted. Daniel began leaving work at reasonable hours instead of staying late by habit. Clara started asking about his projects, really listening to his responses, instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. They began cooking dinner together again, a simple intimacy they had somehow lost along the way. The letters had reminded them of who they used to be, but more importantly, they had revealed who they still could become. Clara kept her favorite letter in her purse, the one where Daniel had written, I love watching you discover things that matter to you. Your passion makes everything more beautiful, including me. Reading those words now, Clara realized that passion hadn't disappeared. It had just been waiting, patient as stone, for someone to rescue it from the rubble of routine. Mary watched over their tentative renewal, her limestone hands extended in blessing over 2 people, learning that love, like faith, required both preservation and transformation. Daniel surprised Clara on Saturday morning by appearing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a rolled set of blueprints. I want to show you something, he said, spreading the drawings across the table where they usually ate breakfast in silence. The plans revealed a small outdoor shrine, elegant in its simplicity. Daniel had designed a curved stone wall to shelter the statue, with built-in planters for flowers and a small bench for prayer or meditation. The structure would transform their utilitarian backyard into a space of contemplation and beauty. It's perfect, Clara breathed, studying the careful dimensions and thoughtful details. But Daniel, this must cost. I have savings, money I've been keeping for something important, and you think this is important? Daniel looked at her directly. I think you're important. I think what matters to you should matter to me. They spent the morning at garden centers, selecting plants and materials. Clara marveled at this version of Daniel. Engaged, creative, asking her opinion about flower colors and stone textures as if her preferences truly mattered to him. When had they stopped consulting each other about decisions, even small ones? The physical work of preparing the site brought them together in ways their careful conversations couldn't. Digging out the foundation, Clara and Daniel developed a rhythm of shared labor that felt familiar and new simultaneously. They traded tools, pointed out obstacles, solved problems together without the layer of politeness that had insulated them from real partnership. Hand me that level, Daniel called from where he knelt, checking the stone placement. The level or the measuring tape? Both. Actually, come help me see if this looks straight. Clara knelt beside him, their shoulders touching as they examined his work. The casual physical proximity, combined with Daniel's request for her opinion, created an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with respect. "It's beautiful," Clara said, and meant both the stonework and the experience of being asked to participate in creating something meaningful. Mrs. Kowalski appeared at the fence line carrying a pitcher of iced tea and her characteristic direct wisdom. "Now this is what I like to see," she announced, surveying their mud-covered clothes and the emerging shrine. Two people working toward the same goal instead of past each other. "It was Daniel's idea," Clara said, unable to hide her pride. "In her husband, smart man. Stanley used to say that the secret to marriage was finding projects you both cared about. Gives you something to build together besides resentment." Helen settled on their back steps, clearly planning to supervise. "You know what this reminds me of? The grotto Stanley built for me after we lost the baby." Clara stopped working, struck by the sadness in Helen's voice. In all their conversations, Mrs. Kowalski had never mentioned losing a child. "We tried for 12 years to have a baby," Helen continued matter-of-factly. 3 miscarriages, 2 stillbirths. After the last one, I couldn't bear to go into churches anymore. All those families, all that hope. It hurt too much." Daniel and Clara exchanged glances, understanding suddenly why Helen had never pressured them about children. "So Stanley built me a little shrine in our backyard. Said I needed a place to talk to God that wasn't full of other people's answered prayers. Best gift anyone ever gave me." "Did it help?" Clara asked gently. "Saved my faith, maybe saved our marriage too. Sometimes you need a place that's just yours, where you can be honest about what you're feeling." That afternoon, as they planted roses around the shrine's base, Clara found herself sharing things she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Her fear that she and Daniel had become strangers, her guilt about not having children, her sense that life was happening to her rather than being chosen by her. Daniel listened without trying to fix or dismiss her feelings, occasionally asking questions that helped her articulate thoughts she'd been carrying alone. "I keep wondering if we stayed together out of habit rather than love," Clara admitted, her hands deep in soil that smelled of possibility. "Is there a difference?" Daniel asked, not defensively but with genuine curiosity. "I think so. Habit is just repetition. Love is choosing someone again and again, even when it's difficult. So, what are we doing now?" Clara looked at Daniel, his face streaked with dirt and concentration as he positioned a climbing rosebush near the statue's base. "I think we're choosing." By evening, they had moved Mary to her new outdoor home. The statue looked magnificent in the shrine, the setting sun casting warm light across her limestone features. The garden space felt transformed, no longer just a backyard, but a sanctuary. Their first visitor arrived the next morning. Mrs. Peterson from 3 houses down knocked tentatively at their front door. "I hope you don't mind," she said shyly. "I saw your statue from the street, and I wondered if I could sit with her for a few minutes. My husband passed last month, and I'm having trouble praying in church. Too many memories." Clara led her to the backyard shrine where Mrs. Peterson settled on the small bench Daniel had built. She sat quietly for 20 minutes, occasionally touching the statue's base, her lips moving in silent conversation. "Thank you," she said as she prepared to leave. "It helps to have a place where grief feels welcome." Word spread quietly through the neighborhood. People began stopping by. Some Clara recognized, others she didn't, drawn by something they couldn't quite name but desperately needed. The shrine became an informal gathering place for those seeking comfort, hope, or simply a moment of peace. In lives that had forgotten how to slow down, Daniel watched this development with growing amazement. "I designed it for you," he told Clara one evening as they observed an elderly man praying at the statue. "I never imagined it would become something for everyone." "Maybe that's what makes it perfect," Clara replied. "You created a space for human connection without even realizing it." That night, Clara lay in bed thinking about containers, Daniel's architectural term for spaces that held and shaped human experience. Their marriage had become a container too, she realized, but one that had grown rigid with routine and expectation. The shrine had somehow cracked that container open, allowing room for growth, for surprise, for the kind of love that chose renewal over resignation. Outside their bedroom window, Mary stood watch over their sleeping neighborhood, her hands extended, in blessing over a community, learning that sacred spaces could exist anywhere. People gathered with open hearts. 3 weeks after completing the shrine, Clara discovered the medical reports while looking for their insurance cards to schedule a routine appointment. The manila folder lay tucked beneath Daniel's desk calendar, labeled simply "Personal" in his careful handwriting. She opened it without thinking, expecting to find tax documents or warranty information. Instead, she found test results, consultation notes, and a diagnosis that made her sink into Daniel's desk chair as if her legs had forgotten how to hold her weight. Multiple sclerosis. Early stage, relapsing remitting type. Diagnosed 6 months. Ego? Clara stared at the neurologist's letterhead until the words blurred, her mind struggling to process information that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about their marriage. The emotional distance, Daniel's increased fatigue, his reluctance to make long-term plans, his sudden focus on financial security, everything took on new meaning in the harsh light of this hidden truth. The dates on the medical reports created a timeline that made Clara's chest tighten with understanding. Daniel's first symptoms had appeared around the time she'd started complaining about their growing apart. While she'd been interpreting his withdrawal as lack of interest in their marriage, he'd been grappling with a diagnosis that threatened everything they'd built together. When Daniel came home from work, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, with the folder open in front of her. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the papers, his face cycling through surprise, resignation, and something that looked like relief. "You found them," he said quietly. 6 months, Daniel. You've known. For 6 months and didn't tell me? Daniel set down his briefcase and sat across from her, his movements careful in a way she now recognized as accommodation rather than mere caution. "I was trying to figure out how to tell you. How to tell me. I'm your wife. I'm supposed to be the first person you tell something like this. Are you? Because lately it feels like we're more like roommates than partners." The accusation stung, because Clara couldn't entirely dispute it, but it also revealed the impossible burden Daniel had been carrying alone. "So you decided to handle a multiple sclerosis diagnosis by yourself, without any support. I didn't want to burden you with something you didn't sign up for. I signed up for in sickness and in health. That was the whole point of the promise we made." Daniel looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with his disease and everything to do with the weight of secrets. "Clara, our marriage was already struggling. I couldn't ask you to commit to caring for someone who might become dependent when you were already pulling away from me." The logic was heartbreaking and infuriating simultaneously. Clara wanted to shake him for his noble stupidity and hold him for the fear that had driven such terrible isolation. "Is that why you've been so distant? You were protecting me from your illness?" "I was protecting both of us. If our marriage was going to end, better it happened before you felt trapped by obligation." Clara stared at her husband, seeing him clearly, for perhaps the first time in months. The careful way he'd been moving wasn't just middle-aged stiffness. The fatigue she'd attributed to work stress was actually his body fighting an autoimmune battle. His increased focus on financial planning wasn't obsessiveness, but practical preparation for an uncertain future. "You idiot," she said, but without anger. "You complete noble self-sacrificing idiot. Clara, do you have any idea what these past 6 months have been like for me? Thinking you were falling out of love with me. Believing that I'd become someone you could barely tolerate." Daniel's face crumpled. "I thought I was sparing you. You were abandoning me. There's a difference." They sat in silence. The medical reports spread between them like evidence of how thoroughly good intentions could destroy trust. Clara felt anger and grief and relief competing for space in her chest. The statue, she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. That's why you were so resistant to me rescuing the statue. You thought I was going to have enough to deal with already. Daniel nodded. When I saw you fighting so hard to save something sacred, I kept thinking that you were going to need all your strength to save us. If you even wanted to. Of course I want to save us. I love you, Daniel. I married you, not your health status. But what if it gets worse? What if I need help walking or thinking clearly or... Then we'll figure it out together. That's what marriage means. Clara reached across the table and took Daniel's hands, noting the slight tremor in his fingers that she'd been attributing to caffeine consumption. How bad is it right now? Really? Daniel took a shaky breath. Some days are worse than others. The fatigue is the hardest part. Sometimes I can't think clearly, and that terrifies me because my mind is what I use to make a living. Have you told your boss? Are you crazy? They'd find a way to let me go within 6 months. Clara squeezed his hands. Then we figure out other options. Maybe you freelance, design those small churches you used to dream about. Maybe we live differently than we planned. Clara, you don't understand what you're saying. MS is progressive. It doesn't get better. Some marriages don't get better either, but ours has been getting better. We've been choosing each other again. Remember, Daniel looked at her with something between hope and disbelief, even knowing this, especially knowing this. That evening, they walked to the shrine together, Daniel's gait slightly unsteady in a way Clara now understood wasn't just weariness. Several neighbors had left flowers and prayer cards at the statue's base, creating a small garden of petitions and gratitude. I keep thinking about Father Miguel's sermon, Clara said as they settled on the bench Daniel had built, about preserving what's sacred. I thought I was saving a statue, but maybe I was really saving us. How do you figure that? The statue made us start talking again, really talking. If I hadn't brought her home, would you ever have told me about your diagnosis? Daniel considered this. Probably not. I was planning to handle it alone until it became impossible to hide. And then what? I would have discovered your illness at the same time I discovered that you hadn't trusted me enough to share it. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Clara leaned against Daniel's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. Promise me something. What? Promise me no more secrets. If this is going to work, if we're going to work, I need to know what we're dealing with. All of it. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Clara wondered if she was asking for more honesty than their fragile, renewed connection could handle. The doctors want me to start medication that might help slow the progression, he said finally. But there are side effects and no guarantees. I've been putting off the decision because I was afraid of how it might change me. What kind of side effects? Mood changes, cognitive effects, possible depression. I was scared of becoming someone you couldn't love. Clara turned to face him fully. Daniel, I fell in love with your mind, your kindness, your terrible jokes, and your ability to see beauty in buildings that other people take for granted. Your diagnosis doesn't change any of that. But what if the medication does? Then we adapt together. Looking at Mary's patient face in the evening light, Clara realized that faith in God, in marriage, in the future, wasn't about certainty. It was about committing to love despite uncertainty, about choosing hope when fear offered easier alternatives. Start the medication, she said quietly. Let's see what happens when we stop trying to control everything and start trusting that we're strong enough to handle whatever comes. Daniel nodded, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but the kind of determined calm that came from finally knowing what they were fighting for. Word of Daniel's diagnosis spread through their small community with the gentle efficiency of people who cared deeply and spoke carefully. Clara hadn't intended to tell anyone, but when Mrs. Kowalski noticed Daniel's increased fatigue during their garden work and asked directly if everything was all right, Clara found herself unable to lie to someone who had become like family. Multiple sclerosis, Helen repeated thoughtfully, settling heavily onto the bench beside the shrine. Stanley's brother had that, lived with it for 30 years. 30 years! Clara felt a flutter of hope mixed with apprehension. Good years and difficult years, like any life. The secret was adjusting expectations without lowering them. Within days, their refrigerator filled with casseroles and their mailbox with cards, not pity offerings, but practical expressions of community support. Father Miguel visited again, this time not just to bless but to listen, sitting in their kitchen while Daniel spoke honestly about his fears, and Clara admitted her anger at being excluded from such a fundamental challenge. "You're both learning how to be married to someone with a chronic illness," Father Miguel observed. "That's different from the marriage you started with, but it's not necessarily worse." "How can it not be worse?" Daniel asked. "Because it's more honest. You're no longer married to fantasies of each other. You're married to real people, facing real challenges together." The shrine had become a neighborhood fixture, drawing visitors from beyond their immediate area. Clara began finding prayer intentions, left at the statue's base, handwritten requests for healing, forgiveness, guidance, and hope. She and Daniel took turns collecting and reading these small petitions, humbled by the trust strangers placed in their backyard sanctuary. "Look at this one," Clara said one morning, showing Daniel a note written in a child's careful script. "Dear Mary, please help my mom and dad stop fighting. They used to laugh, but now they just argue. Love, Emma." "Should we try to find Emma?" Daniel asked. "I think we should just trust that Mary's listening." The accumulation of prayer intentions became a kind of ministry neither Clara nor Daniel had anticipated. They began to understand that their shrine served not just their own spiritual needs, but their community's hunger for a sacred space that felt accessible and welcoming. Daniel started spending his evenings sketching improvements to the shrine, a small shelter for rainy day visitors, better lighting for evening prayer, perhaps even a little lending library of spiritual books. His architectural eye saw possibilities Clara had never imagined. "You're designing for human connection again," Clara observed, watching him work on plans for a covered meditation area. "I'm designing for us, for this, whatever this is we're building here." "What do you think it is?" Daniel set down his pencil and considered the question seriously. "I think it's what I used to dream about designing. A space where people remember what matters most." As Daniel began his MS medication, Clara watched anxiously for changes in his personality or cognitive function. The side effects, when they came, were subtler than she'd feared, but noticeable enough to require adjustment. Some days, Daniel felt foggy, struggling to find words he'd used easily his entire career. Other days, he experienced mood swings that left them both exhausted. "I feel like I'm disappearing," he confided one particularly difficult evening when the medication had left him unable to concentrate on even simple tasks. "You're not disappearing. You're changing, and change is hard, but you're still you." "How can you be sure?" Clara thought about this carefully. "Because yesterday when Mrs. Peterson came to pray at the shrine, you noticed she looked cold and brought her a cup of tea without being asked. Because you redesigned the garden layout 3 times to make sure wheelchairs could navigate it easily. Because you're still the man who sees what people need and tries to provide it. Even when my brain feels like mush, especially then. Kindness doesn't come from your brain, Daniel. It comes from your heart." Father Miguel suggested they organize a formal blessing ceremony for the shrine, acknowledging its role in their community and celebrating what Clara and Daniel had created together. The idea both excited and terrified Clara, making their private healing public felt simultaneously appropriate and vulnerable. "What if no one comes?" she worried. "What if everyone comes?" Daniel countered, equally anxious about the opposite possibility. They settled on a simple evening service, inviting their neighbors and the extended community that had grown around the shrine. Clara prepared by cleaning the statue thoroughly, polishing Mary's weathered features until they gleamed in the afternoon sun. Daniel finished the small improvements he'd been working on: better seating, landscape lighting, a small table for flowers and candles. The day before the blessing, Clara experienced a crisis of faith that caught her completely off guard. Standing in their backyard, looking at the shrine that had become the center of their renewed life, she suddenly wondered if they were playing at religion rather than practicing it. "What if this is all just elaborate self-deception?" she asked Daniel as they arranged flowers around the statue's base. "What if we're no different than we were before, just with better stage props?" Daniel stopped working and looked at her seriously. "Oh, do you feel the same as you did before?" Clara considered this honestly. "No, I feel more connected to you, to our community, to something larger than myself." "Then it's not self-deception, it's growth." "But what if the blessing ceremony is a mistake? What if we're making too big a deal of something that should stay and private? Clara, look around you." Daniel gestured toward the prayer intentions tucked into the shrine's crevices, the worn path visitors had created across their lawn, the small garden of memorial flowers that had sprouted around the statues. "Baz, this stopped being private the moment we put her outside. We're not making it public. We're acknowledging that it already is." That evening, Clara sat alone with the statue for the last time before the ceremony. The limestone figure seemed to have developed more expression over the months, or perhaps Clara had simply learned to read the subtle variations in shadow and light across Mary's features. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Clara whispered to the patient face. "What if I can't live up to what people expect? What if our marriage isn't as healed as it seems? What if Daniel gets worse and I can't handle it?" The statue offered no audible response, but sitting in her presence, Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not answers to her questions, but acceptance of the questions themselves. Faith, she was learning, didn't require certainty. It required showing up despite uncertainty, choosing love despite risk, committing to growth despite the possibility of failure. Daniel found her there an hour later, still sitting in contemplative silence. "Second thoughts?" he asked gently. "Third and fourth thoughts, but I keep coming back to the same conclusion, which is that this, us, the shrine, our community, it's not perfect, but it's real. And real is better than the artificial perfection we were trying to maintain before." Daniel settled beside her on the bench, and they sat together, watching the evening light fade across their transformed backyard. Tomorrow would bring celebration and community, joy and vulnerability, the kind of public commitment that made private doubts impossible to sustain. "Are you scared?" Clara asked. "Terrified," Daniel admitted, "but also excited. When's the last time we did something that mattered enough to be scared about?" Clara couldn't remember, which seemed like both a tragedy and an opportunity, all the more reason to embrace whatever came next. The shrine stood ready for its blessing, flowers arranged with care, lights positioned to create warmth and welcome, seating prepared for however many people chose to witness their small act of faith made public. Mary waited with her characteristic patience, hands extended in blessing over a couple learning that love, like faith, required both courage and surrender. Tomorrow, they would find out what their community thought of their experiment in sacred space-making. Tonight, they could simply be grateful for the journey that had brought them this far, from distant strangers sharing a house to partners creating something beautiful together, one day at a time. The blessing ceremony began at sunset, golden light filtering through the trees as neighbors gathered in Clara and Daniel's backyard. More people came than Clara had dared hope, not just their immediate community, but families from St. Catherine's, former congregation, Daniel's colleagues, Clara's students and their parents, faces both familiar and new, drawn by word of mouth and simple curiosity. Father Miguel arrived, carrying a small bottle of holy water and wearing his best ceremonial vestments, lending gravity to the informal gathering. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting old parishioners and welcoming newcomers with equal warmth. "I've been thinking about this moment for weeks," he told Clara as they stood near the shrine, watching people find places to sit on the folding chairs Daniel had borrowed from their church's community center. "This feels like what church is supposed to be, People gathered around something sacred in the middle of ordinary life. Clara felt nervous energy coursing through her as more people arrived than they'd prepared for. Daniel appeared at her elbow, with additional chairs, his movements careful but determined, despite the medication's effects. "We're going to run out of seating," he murmured. "People can stand or sit on the grass. This isn't about perfect logistics." Mrs. Kowalski had positioned herself in the front row, beaming with proprietorial pride, as if she'd personally orchestrated the entire evening. She'd brought a covered dish and appointed herself unofficial hostess, directing late arrivals to available spots and ensuring everyone felt welcome. As the formal blessing began, Father Miguel invited Clara and Daniel to stand beside the statue while he offered prayers in both English and Spanish, acknowledging the diverse community that had grown around their simple shrine. The holy water caught the last rays of sunlight as he sprinkled it over Mary's limestone features. "This statue has found a new home," Father Miguel said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "But more than that, she has helped create a new kind of community, one that transcends denominational boundaries and welcomes all who seek comfort, hope, and connection." Clara felt Daniel's hand find hers as the priest continued. "Today we bless not just this statue, but the love that preserved her, the partnership that created this sacred space, and the community that has grown around both." When Father Miguel invited Clara to speak, she felt momentarily paralyzed by the sea of faces looking at her expectantly. But Mary's patient presence steadied her, and she found words she hadn't prepared. "6 months ago, I was watching my childhood and church get torn down, and I felt like I was losing everything that had ever felt sacred to me," Clara began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "My marriage felt distant, my faith felt hollow, and I couldn't see any way forward that didn't involve accepting less than I'd once hoped for." She glanced at Daniel, drawing strength from his encouraging nod. "When I saw the bulldozers getting ready to destroy this statue, something in me rebelled. I couldn't save the church building, but I could save this one thing that had witnessed so many prayers, so many moments of human connection with the divine." Clara paused, looking around at the gathered faces, seeing her own story reflected in many of their expressions. "What I didn't expect was how saving Mary would teach me about saving everything else I thought I'd lost." My husband and I began talking again, really talking, about dreams we'd forgotten and fears we'd never shared. We started working together instead of just existing parallel to each other. Daniel stepped forward, his voice joining hers in a way they hadn't planned, but that felt completely natural. "Clara saved more than a statue," he said. "She saved our marriage by reminding us that some things are worth fighting for, even when you're not sure how to fight for them." The crowd was quiet, attentive in the way people became when they recognized their own struggles being articulated. "We learned that we'd been living like strangers because we were both afraid of being disappointed by someone we loved," Daniel continued. "But disappointment, even illness, even uncertainty about the future, those things can't destroy love unless we let them." Father Miguel stepped forward with the final blessing, his hands raised over both the statue and the assembled community. "May this shrine continue to be a place where people remember that we are not alone in our struggles, our hopes, or our need for connection with something greater than ourselves." As the formal ceremony concluded and people began moving toward the refreshment table Mrs. Kowalski had organized, Clara felt overwhelmed by the warmth of community response. Neighbors she barely knew approached to share their own stories. Marriages that had struggled, faith that had wavered, moments when a simple sacred space had provided exactly what they needed. "Thank you for creating this," whispered Mrs. Peterson, the widow who had been one of their first visitors. "I've been able to pray again because of what you've done here." As the evening continued, something unexpected happened. While Clara and Daniel mingled with their guests, sharing coffee and Mrs. Kowalski's famous pound cake, Father Miguel approached them with a suggestion that caught them completely off guard. "I've been watching you two tonight," he said quietly, pulling them aside near the statue. "The way you spoke about your marriage, the honesty about your struggles and renewal, it reminded me of the wedding vows you made 15 years ago." Clara felt Daniel's hand tighten around hers as they both sensed where this conversation might lead. "What are you suggesting, Father?" Daniel asked. "Would you consider renewing your vows? Here, tonight, with this community as witnesses? It seems fitting, given what you've shared about rediscovering your commitment to each other." Clara's breath caught. She looked at Daniel, searching his face for any sign of reluctance, but found only the same mixture of nervousness and hope. She felt in her own chest. "Right now?" Clara asked. "We're not prepared." "The best vows are never prepared," Father Miguel smiled. "They come from the heart in the moment when love chooses itself again." Daniel turned to face Clara fully, taking both her hands in his. Around them, their guests had begun to sense something significant happening, conversations quieting as attention focused on the couple standing beside Mary's patient figure. "Clara," Daniel said softly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I married you 15 years ago, thinking I knew what forever meant. I thought it meant promising to love you as long as you stayed the person I fell in love with." Clara felt tears gathering as Daniel's words reached the heart of everything they'd learned. "But these past months have taught me that forever means something different. It means choosing to love you as you grow and change, as I grow and change, as life challenges us in ways we never expected." Clara nodded, finding her own words. "I thought marriage was supposed to be easy, if we were right for each other. I thought if we were truly meant to be together, we wouldn't have to work so hard to understand each other." She looked around at their friends and neighbors, people who had supported them through this journey of rediscovery. "But saving Mary taught me that the most valuable things require preservation, attention, daily choice. Love isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create together, one day at a time." Father Miguel stepped forward with the small container of holy water he'd used to bless the statue. "Do you, Clara and Daniel, choose each other again? Not as the young people who made promises they couldn't fully understand, but as the adults who have learned what those promises actually require." "I do," Clara said, her voice strong and certain. "I do," Daniel echoed, and Clara heard in his voice not just commitment but joy, the kind of happiness that came from choosing something difficult and worthwhile. Father Miguel blessed their original wedding rings with the same holy water he'd used on Mary, transforming the simple gold bands into symbols of renewed commitment. Around them, their community watched with the kind of reverence reserved for witnessing something sacred. Mrs. Kowalski dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while several other couples held hands, perhaps remembering their own wedding vows and the journey those promises had required. "By the power of love witnessed and community gathered," Father Miguel declared, "I pronounce you husband and wife, again renewed and blessed for the journey ahead." The applause that followed felt different from typical wedding celebration, deeper, more understanding of what commitment actually meant when stripped of romance and grounded in reality. As their guests began to approach with congratulations, Clara marveled at how this unplanned ceremony felt more meaningful than their original wedding. Then they had been promising theoretical love to theoretical future versions of themselves. Tonight, they were promising actual love to the real people they had become. "How do you feel, Mrs. Martinez?" Daniel asked quietly, using the teasing tone she remembered from their early marriage. "Like we're just getting started, Mr. Martinez." The evening concluded with their community lingering far longer than anyone had planned, reluctant to break the spell of connection and celebration. Children played on the grass, while adults shared stories and laughter, the shrine providing a focal point that somehow made every conversation feel more meaningful. Finally, as the last guests departed with promises to visit the shrine soon, Clara and Daniel found themselves alone with Mary in the gentle darkness. The statue seemed to glow in the landscape lighting Daniel had installed, her limestone features peaceful and knowing. "Do you think she approves?" Clara asked, settling onto the bench beside her husband. "I think she's been waiting for this all along," Daniel replied, his arm around Clara's shoulders, feeling both familiar and wonderfully new. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that love, like faith, was not a destination, but a practice, something that required daily choice, seasonal renewal, and the courage to begin again whenever necessary. 3 months after the blessing ceremony, Clara sat in her backyard with her first cup of morning coffee, watching Daniel adjust the placement of a new bench he'd built for the growing number of daily visitors to their shrine. His movements showed the subtle effects of his MS medication, a slight tremor in his hands, occasional difficulty with balance, but also revealed the contentment of someone engaged in meaningful work. The morning ritual had become sacred to Clara. Coffee with Mary, prayer journal in hand, watching their neighborhood wake up around the quiet center they'd created. The leather-bound book Daniel had given her for Christmas contained months of written conversations with God, a practice that had grown from desperate pleading to grateful dialogue. "Mrs. Rodriguez wants to commission a shrine for her sisters." "Memory," Daniel said, settling beside Clara with his own coffee. "Something similar to ours, but adapted for their smaller yard. You're going to design it?" "Already started sketching. It feels good to create spaces that matter to people." Daniel had left his corporate architecture job 2 months ago, choosing freelance work that allowed him to focus on residential projects and small community buildings, the kind of human-centered design he'd abandoned years earlier. The financial adjustment required careful budgeting, but their life felt richer for the trade. "Any regrets about leaving the firm?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer in Daniel's increased energy and creativity. "Only that it took me so long. I keep thinking about what Father Miguel said, that sometimes God has to tear something down before we can build what we're really meant to create." Mrs. Kowalski appeared at the fence line, as she did most mornings, carrying a small bouquet from her garden for the shrine. At 73, Helen had adopted the role of unofficial caretaker, arriving each day to water the plants, collect prayer intentions, and chat with early visitors who sought counsel along with comfort. "That young couple is back again," she announced, nodding toward a man and woman in their 20s who knelt together at the statue's base. "Third time this week. Marriage troubles, if I had to guess." Clara and Daniel had learned to recognize the rhythm of their visitors, the desperate intensity of first-time seekers, the grateful return of those who'd found comfort, the regular pilgrimage of neighborhood families who'd incorporated the shrine into their weekly routine. "Should we say something to them?" Clara wondered aloud. "Let them find what they need to." "Find," Helen advised. "Sometimes the best ministry is just creating space for people to encounter the divine on their own terms." The shrine had evolved over the months into something beyond what Clara and Daniel had originally envisioned. A small library box now held donated books on spirituality and marriage. Local artists had contributed small tokens, painted stones, wind chimes, a hand-carved cross, that transformed the space into a folk art installation as much as a religious shrine. Most significantly, other couples had begun requesting blessing ceremonies for their own renewed commitments, turning Clara and Daniel's backyard into an informal center for marriage renewal. Father Miguel conducted these services monthly, creating a ministry that served couples seeking to revitalize relationships that had grown stagnant or repair bonds that had been damaged. "It's like we've become accidentally pastoral," Daniel observed, as they watched the young couple conclude their prayer and walk hand in hand toward the street. "Maybe there's no such thing as accidental ministry," Clara replied. "Maybe we just create spaces for love, and ministry happens naturally." At work, Clara had been promoted to head counselor, a role that utilized her growing ability to help people navigate relationship challenges and life transitions. Her experience with the statue and marriage renewal had deepened her empathy and practical wisdom, making her more effective with both students and their families. Daniel's MS remained stable, the medication managing his symptoms without the severe side effects they'd feared. Some days were more difficult than others, but they'd learned to adjust their expectations without lowering their hopes. Helen's wisdom proving prophetic. "I have something for you," Daniel said, pulling a small, wrapped package from his jacket pocket. Inside, Clara found a pendant, a tiny replica of their Mary statue, carved from the same limestone and suspended on a simple gold chain. "I commissioned it from the same artist who carved the original," Daniel explained, as Clara lifted the delicate necklace. "I wanted you to carry a piece of her with you." Clara felt tears gather as Daniel fastened the chain around her neck. The small Mary settled against her chest, a tangible reminder of everything the larger statue represented: preservation, renewal, the choice to save what mattered most. "It's perfect," she whispered, touching the tiny carved face. That evening, as they prepared for bed in the bedroom they now shared with genuine intimacy rather than mere convenience, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them from distant strangers to renewed partners. The wedding photo on her nightstand no longer looked like evidence of what they'd lost, but rather like the beginning of a story they were still writing. Outside their window, Mary stood watch over their sleeping neighborhood, her hands extended, in blessing over a community that had learned to create sacred space wherever love was chosen, over fear, connection over isolation, hope over resignation. Clara's prayer journal lay open on her nightstand, the day's entry a simple expression of gratitude. "Thank you for teaching us that saving something sacred means saving ourselves. Thank you for showing us that love, like faith, requires both preservation and transformation. Thank you for Mary, for Daniel, for second chances, and for the courage to begin again." The Virgin Mary statue continued her patient ministry, witness to the truth that sometimes the most desperate acts of preservation become the first steps toward the most profound renewals.